Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Opponents of an underwater oil pipeline in Michigan are taking on the project on a number of legal fronts. The state's tribes are among those supporting the case now in front of the U.S. Supreme Court to determine whether the state or federal government should have say over the pipeline's future. Meanwhile, a case before the Michigan Supreme Court challenges whether the environmental review is sufficient. The decisions in both cases have far-reaching consequences over the future of such projects in Michigan and elsewhere. We'll hear from stakeholders after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. The Inupiat community of Kaktovik in northern Alaska is known as the polar bear capital of the U.S. Hundreds of tourists used to flock to the village of about 250 people to see bears. But several years ago, the tours were halted because of opposition from residents. Ayolna Naiden with the Alaska Desk has more on what happened to the tours and what the tribe's doing to revive them.
It's polar bear ground right there.
Nathan Gordon Jr. is driving his truck on the spit right outside of Kaktovik. He's mayor and leads the town's polar bear patrol program. Under his backseat, he has a shotgun, and in his console, shotgun rounds and cracker shells. Kaktovik sits on Barter Island on the Beaufort seacoast. In late summer and fall, up to 80 polar bears come on land, a trend that has been increasing as the sea ice diminishes. That brought the need for patrol and created opportunities for polar bear viewing. The pandemic put a pause on visitation. Then the federal government halted the tours. Gordon says Kaktovik leaders have been working to revive them.
Let's get this place back to making money, and it'll be great for everybody.
Kitil Reitan started the company Kaktovik Tours in 2010. By 2019, he and his two children took several hundred tourists a season.
We were able to make a year income in about 6 weeks.
The number of tourists soared from about 50 in 2010 to over 1,000. Tourism grew so quickly, residents were worried it was interfering with subsistence practices. Nora Jane Burns says that visitors would book out seats on small flights and limit the amount of freight that was coming in.
Especially when we have elders that go out for medical, and then when they try to come back, the flights would be booked.
The COVID-19 pandemic shut down the tours. A year later, the U.S. Department of Interior issued an order to pause commercial polar bear viewing permits. Since then, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been collaborating with the city and village of Kaktovik, as well as Kaktovik Inupiat Corporation. Gordon says that this time around, he wants the community to develop infrastructure for tourists and focus more on educating them. But who will run the tours? Burns is busy with her job at Kaktovik Public Works Department, and Reitan sold his boats and moved to Nome. But they both hope the younger generation will take over polar bear tours. I am Ayolna Naiden.
A South Dakota high schooler is receiving one of the nation's highest honors for citizens by the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. As South Dakota Public Broadcasting's Jackson Dirks reports, the student has helped provide food, backpacks, holiday gifts, and essentials to children and families on the Pine Ridge Reservation.
Cody Two-Bowls came up with an idea 4 years ago at baseball practice. His teammates told him they didn't have backpacks and school supplies. Two-Bowls began trying to find donations to help his teammates, but pretty quickly realized there were a lot of people needing the resources.
Instead of helping out just specifically my teammates or my family, what if I did it for everyone?
Two-Bowls created what's called Baseball and Backpacks. People donate items on Walmart and Amazon shopping lists, and those get sent to Two-Bowls' house. He then gathers the items, things like notebooks and toiletries, into backpacks for students. The giveaway is done at a baseball field where simultaneously Two-Bowls holds a baseball clinic that teaches kids the fundamentals of the sport. There are 4 of these different drives annually. He does this on top of being a multi-sport athlete at Makpialuta. Two-Bowls is one of 5 individuals in the country named a 2026 Citizen Honors Award recipient. He's receiving the Service Act Award, which honors Americans who consistently place others before themselves through a focused initiative of volunteer service.
It's crazy to me how just by helping others, I was able to get recognized for that.
He'll be honored March 25th in Washington, D.C. I'm Jackson Dirks.
And I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by the American Indian College Fund, providing millions of dollars of scholarships to Native students every year. Applications are accepted through May 31st at collegefund.org or by phone at 800-766-FUND.
Support by the Gathering of Nations Powwow. The last dance is this April 24th and 25th at Expo, New Mexico. Gone's last horse rider and regalia parade takes place at 4 p.m. both days. Tickets at gatheringofnations.com and at the gates.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. The U.S. Supreme Court will soon decide on a jurisdictional issue involving the Line 5 oil pipeline in Michigan that has high stakes for tribes. The court will decide whether the state or the federal government has authority over the project. Tribes are putting their power behind the state's argument. Michigan wants to shut down the pipeline, saying the possibility of an oil spill in the Great Lakes is too great a risk. The Canada-based Line 5 company Enbridge argues the issue goes beyond Michigan to include international energy supplies. The pipeline also traverses important tribal hunting and fishing grounds and areas central to creation stories. Today on our show, we'll hear from legal experts on the case. We'll also hear from the chairwoman of the Bad River Tribe in Wisconsin and their ongoing legal battle with Line 5. You can join us with your comments and questions. Call 1-800-996-2848. Also, 1-800-99-NATIVE. That number works just as well. And a disclosure, Enbridge has been a past underwriter for Native America Calling. That does not have any influence on our editorial coverage of this issue. Let's now meet today's guest. Joining us first from East Lansing, Michigan is Winona Single. She is an associate professor of law at Michigan State University College of Law and associate director of the Indigenous Law and Policy Center. She is a citizen of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, and she's been on the show before. Hello, Winona, and welcome back.
Me.
Thanks for joining us, Winona. And joining us from Boulder, Colorado, we have Melissa Kay. She is a Tribal Water Institute Fellow at the Native American Rights Fund, and she's also been on Native America Calling before. Melissa, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate both of you taking the time today to educate our listeners on this issue. And Winona, I want to begin with you because in arguments to the Supreme Court, the state of Michigan argues it has the authority over pipeline operation. What's at stake depending on how the Supreme Court rules?
Yeah, so the case that was argued before the U.S. Supreme Court recently, Enbridge Energy versus Nestle, it actually is a case that really deals with a fairly narrow procedural issue because originally the Attorney General of Michigan had filed suit in Michigan State Court back in 2019 alleging that Line 5 was a public nuisance and violated multiple state laws and wanted to basically void the easement for the pipeline and shut it down. And then 2 years after the suit was filed, Enbridge sought to remove the case from state to federal court. However, there's a federal statute, and that federal statute imposes a 30-day deadline for a motion to remove the case from state to federal court. And so both the federal district judge and the Sixth Circuit held that the deadline was mandatory and applied, and Enbridge had missed it. And so the Supreme Court is reviewing whether that deadline is mandatory or can be, whether there's any exception that would allow Enbridge to still remove the case from state to federal court. So that's the legal issue in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, Winona. Is there any precedent with regard to some type of similar case where a 30-day deadline to move a case from a state court to a federal court, a Supreme Court, for example, has gone one way or the other for a tribe that attorneys are looking at?
Not that I'm aware of for tribes. Certainly there was a recognized circuit split in the federal courts of appeals, which always makes the Supreme Court more likely to accept a case that's where a review is sought. And so this will be the Supreme Court's opportunity to make a decision about whether there can be any exception to this statutory 30-day removal deadline. And I think it's unlikely that the court is going to find that there is any exception, and that's important because it would mean that the case stays in state court, and that's important because I think many feel that state courts are more likely to be favorable to protecting the Great Lakes, whereas federal courts are often viewed as more favorable to corporations and interstate commerce.
Winona, the pipeline crosses an international border. Is that a key element in the legal argument either way?
Well, so there is, I think that what you might be asking about is the fact that there's a claim that Canada has said that, wait a second, if you shut down the pipeline, that will violate what's called the 1977 Transit Treaty. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, it is. Because that's
yes.
Right. Tell me more about that issue.
Absolutely. So this is a really interesting situation because in this case, Canada is basically arguing that the Transit Treaty of 1977 prohibits shutting down a cross-border pipeline between Canada and the United States. But we also have, in opposition to that treaty, we also have treaty rights of the tribes. The tribes entered into the Treaty of 1836, and they, in so doing, they made cessions of vast areas of the Lower Peninsula and Upper Peninsula and waters of the Great Lakes, but they also reserved treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather. And so those treaty rights are also at issue with regard to Line 5. And so there's a really interesting conflict because, well, some say it's interesting. The truth is that this, what should really be decisive here is that if there's going to be an abrogation of an Indian treaty, you have to leave it to Congress. Only Congress can clearly express that it is abrogating a treaty right. And so the 1977 Transit Treaty never mentions Indian tribes or any treaties or indigenous rights at all. So you certainly don't have any clear evidence that Congress considered the conflict when it ratified the 1977 Transit Treaty. And so it should be a clear resolution that only Congress has the ability to, abrogate the Treaty of 1836. And in addition, the Trump administration is also weighing in, and there's concern that this is going to impact, international relations. But a couple things, one is that if there is a conflict, that should be resolved in an international forum. So the remedy should be that Canada should go seek international arbitration between sovereigns and not ask, a domestic court in the U.S. or a state court to override a tribe's treaty rights. So, those are important factors too.
Yeah, certainly. Tribes have also been working to stop a plan to build a new pipeline beneath the Straits of Mackinac. This is an important waterway, also culturally significant for many tribes. Tell me more about the Straits and why tribes are invested so seriously with regard to its future.
Sure, I'm happy to. So all of the tribes that signed the Treaty of 1836 are Anishinaabe, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. And the Straits of Mackinac, where the Line 5 crosses the straits from the Upper to Lower Peninsula, is at the center of the Anishinaabe creation story. So that means it's a place that has a profound spiritual, cultural, and also an economic importance to all of the tribes. And certainly a spill could be absolutely devastating and disastrous for environmental purposes, but also in terms of the spiritual and cultural interests of the tribe. In addition to that, we have critical cultural resources that could be impacted by any kind of harm to either a tunnel or a spill of the existing Line 5. We have critical fishery resources, and whitefish is central to Anishinaabe diet and ceremony and economy. And that's already, whitefish has already been harmed due to climate change, and a possible oil spill would just make that devastation even worse. And so also, yeah, go ahead.
Well, Line 5 has had issues in the past. I mean, there have been boats there in the lakes that have damaged it and caused spills and things like that. So there's obviously a lot of concern and a lot of history here that the tribes are looking at.
That's exactly right. I mean, we already know that Line 5 is beyond its original expected lifespan, and it's been hit by anchors multiple times, and another anchor strike could be absolutely devastating and lead to a devastating spill. We also know that Line 5 is already leaked. It's leaked at least 1.1 million gallons over the past 50 years. And we also know that Enbridge, which operates Line 5, they also operate Line 6B. And what we saw here in Michigan is in southern Michigan, Line 6B spilled in 2010, leading to the largest inland spill in U.S. history. You know, I think it was something like 1.2 million gallons spilled into the Kalamazoo River, costing $1 billion to clean up. So we also know that the tools and techniques that Line 5 uses to monitor their pipelines, they're not perfect, and they're certainly subject to human or technological error, and that means that there's always a risk, and that risk is unacceptable.
All right, thank you, Winona. A spokesperson from Enbridge could not appear on our show today, but they did send a written statement. It says the company is encouraged that the U.S. Supreme Court has heard arguments and is reviewing the June 2024 decision of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. The statement goes on to say that there are significant implications for energy security and foreign affairs if the Attorney General continues to pursue the lawsuit now in state court. Enbridge believes that federal law prohibits the Attorney General from shutting down Line 5 based on the 1977 Transit Pipelines Treaty, which prohibits Michigan from impeding the operation of the pipeline. It would also undermine the legal doctrine that reserves foreign affairs matters for the federal government. A full statement by the company will be available on our website, nativeamericacalling.com. Short break, and we'll come back and continue this conversation. And for callers who would like to join us, the number is 1-800-996-2848. 1-800-996-2848. Let's get some calls going. This is Sean Spruce, host of Native America Calling. You can listen in every weekday to hear the only national call-in show from a Native American perspective. We explore topics that range from traditional cultural practices to up-to-the-minute news that affects every American. We hope you can join us for the next Native America Calling.
Attention tribal community leaders. The 2026 Tribal Self-Governance Conference takes place this April 7th to the 9th at the Gila River Wild Horse Pass Resort and Casino in Chandler, Arizona. Tribal delegation meetings using AI, Indian Health 101, land stewardship, tribal values-based communications training, understanding the tribal-federal relationship, and more, all at one convening. The full draft agenda and registration are available at tribalselfgov.org, who support this show.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. We're continuing our conversation now about the latest developments in a legal challenge by tribes against the Line 5 pipeline that spans parts of Canada, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Listeners can join our conversation with comments or questions by calling 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. You can also continue the conversation on our website and social media pages like Facebook and Instagram. Let's hear now from Melissa Kay with the Native American Rights Fund. Melissa, NARF represents the Bay Mills community in northern Michigan. What is the tribe's environmental concern about this issue we're talking about today?
Yeah, thank you so much. So NARF and Earth Justice both represent the Bay Mills Indian community and have been, the Bay Mills has been involved in both the litigation that Professor Single was talking about and litigation that has been in front of the Michigan Supreme Court recently, as well as state and federal proceedings that are considering permits for the tunnel project that you were both talking about just now. So Bay Mills has been incredibly involved in all of these processes and has been really, really interested in advocating for the protection, recognition, and upholding of the tribal nations' treaty rights under the Treaty of 1836. So a lot of the environmental concerns that the tribes are concerned about with both the pipeline and with the tunnel project have to do with the fact that if there's a spill in the straits, Professor Singal was talking about the spill on Line 6B and how that had massive, massive impacts, was extremely costly, and that directly impacted another tribal nation that's been involved, the Nottawasapi Huron Band of the Potawatomi. But the straits, a spill in the straits would be even more destructive. The Great Lakes provide clean drinking water for 40 million people, so not just tribal nations. That's, I think, about 84% of the surface freshwater in North America. And so an oil spill in the straits in this location, I mean, that has direct impacts on the tribal nations for, their ceremonial, their cultural resources, which are environmental resources, fishing, continuing practices that they've been practicing since time immemorial. And then it also is, a spill there would be incredibly and immensely destructive for many, many people. And that would be, it would destroy a lot of the ecosystems in the Great Lakes.
Okay. And in addition to these environmental issues, problems, challenges that you cite, what else is the Bay Mills Indian community concerned about?
Yeah, so again, as Professor Singal was sort of referencing, the 1836 Treaty of Washington, which is the treaty that protects the rights of Bay Mills Indian community, that's talking about the tribal nations' rights to hunt and fish and gather in their traditional homelands, but it also has language that protects other usual privileges of occupancy throughout their ceded territories. And that has been interpreted in case law as being broader than just hunting and fishing. That also has to do with living the way that the Indian people have always been living, have been in the habit of living, and that's a direct quote, living in the way, and using all of those natural resources that are protected under the treaty for economic and ceremonial purposes. So the concern here is that a spill, that's not really being adequately considered in either the context of the revocation of the easement for this pipeline or these, the permits that Enbridge is currently seeking for the tunnel project, that a spill not being adequately considered there would really have absolutely destructive impacts on all of these treaty-protected rights and on the ability of Bay Mills Indian community to continue to practice respect and conduct ceremony with regard to their resting relatives, and especially thinking about the impact of the tunnel project. Enbridge has sort of posed in some of these court forums, like the option is, place the pipeline in a more protective tunnel, or the only other outside option is to leave the pipelines as is, which we know everyone, including the state of Michigan, is extremely concerned about in terms of the environmental impacts of a potential oil spill. But the reality is that is a really false comparison, because the sort of impacts that we would see from the tunnel project would include extreme damage to the resting relatives of the tribal nations that have been burying their ancestors in this land for a long time. So there's, a false narrative that's being put forward by Enbridge around this, and there are a lot of concerns from the tribal nations about the adequate protection of their treaty rights.
Okay. Melissa, Enbridge is arguing the project will be safe and heavily monitored. Why are these arguments falling so short for the Bay Mills Indian community?
I mean, so in addition to sort of what's already been stated in terms of the bad record of Enbridge and the fact that, spills from lines that have been operated by Enbridge have been directly impacting tribal nations in Michigan in the past, and there have been, I think Professor Singal was saying, about 1.1 million gallons of oil that have been spilled over, I think, 33 different incidents in the past 20 years. And so there's just the fact that, trusting an actor that has been known to have repeated spills and damage to their pipelines and have not responded with the, type of alacrity or quickness that you would hope to see, that it's just placing a lot of trust on a bad actor. And then in addition, in a lot of these permitting processes, for example, there's just been a real sort of narrowing of the consideration of what real alternatives exist. And there has been research that's been put forward both by the tribal nations and environmental organizations and others around the fact that a pipeline does not really need to go through the Straits of Mackinac. This is an extremely potentially destructive area if there were a spill. And it really does not need to go, through the Straits at all. There are options, including increasing the capacity of other pipelines or using other ways to transport petroleum products. And so those aren't really being taken into real consideration. And again, that false sort of comparison of you only get the option between the existing pipeline or the tunnel is being put forward. And that's not the case. So the tribes are really interested in seeing those alternatives be truly considered by state and federal agencies, and have been sort of advocating for that in the context of ongoing litigation.
Okay. Now, Enbridge is also saying that this project is essential for international energy supplies. And, we certainly have seen the importance of energy stability in recent weeks. Does the company have a point there with that argument?
I think I would say two things. One, there's been research that's been put forward by experts, including Enbridge's experts in some of the Bad River litigation, that showed that prices around oil would increase by, I think, less than a cent, and if Line 5 was shut down and other alternatives were being used, and that the market would be responsive to a shutdown of Line 5. I believe that within 3 months, it would be about 84%, like the market would respond 84%, and then within 18 months, 100%. So that's one point, is that Enbridge's own experts are acknowledging that the market would be responsive to a Line 5 shutdown. Line 5 has been shut down in the past in response to potential spills based on an anchor strike, and there was no sky is falling scenario that happened during that shutdown. And it's really important to know that, Line 5 as it stands right now, so much of the petroleum products are being delivered to Sarnia, to Canada, and that the impacts to Michigan citizens would be extremely minimal, and those resources would be very easily replaced. And so on the sort of direct economic front, those are things that, state agencies, federal agencies, courts need to be taking into consideration. And then the other thing is, I know you just sort of signaled recent instability around oil prices, is that at the end of the day, this is also a signal of the dangers of over-reliance on oil supplies, and the fact that, that's something that does pose a threat if there are not alternatives that are being taken into account. But at the end of the day, this is really an existential fight for the tribal nations, and so all of these points, they really want to have considered. Okay.
Melissa, this upcoming Supreme Court decision will be the last word on whether this pipeline is built?
It will certainly not be the last word. This fight is far from over. There are cases that are being heard at the Sixth Circuit right now. There are cases that are being heard in front of Michigan Supreme Court. There are at least 3 potential, permitting, agency permits that still need to be received by Enbridge in order to start any type of construction and for the tunnel. So in no way has Enbridge, received the go-ahead, and nor will it, once the Supreme Court has ruled one way or another.
Okay. Professor Winona Singal, how about you? Tribes in Michigan argue that the culmination of this legal fight could strengthen or weaken tribal sovereignty. What's ultimately at stake here for not just Michigan tribes, but tribes across the country as well?
Right. I think that it's critical that we note that these massive infrastructure projects have posed significant environmental as well as cultural risks for the population as a whole and for Native people. And so I think that what we're seeing here as this battle over Line 5 is being played out is we're seeing, those infrastructure and access to continued and growing crude oil pitted against tribal interests in protecting their resources against what could be devastating damage and harm due to a spill. And so absolutely, this this conflict over Line 5 and how it ends up being resolved could have important implications across the country for other tribes. And we're also seeing, of course, that the current administration is, not working to try to uphold its trust responsibility by really working to carefully uphold the tribe's interests here. And we've also seen that, for example, the Trump administration filed a statement of interest in Wisconsin supporting Enbridge's request to stay a shutdown of Line 5 over Bad River, which I know we'll talk about in a moment. But also, the Trump administration has used declarations of national energy emergencies to fast track, environmental reviews of federal actions that are critical, including in the case of Line 5. So, yeah, this is a lot of changes are happening here that are important to tribes across the country.
Mm-hmm. And Winona, Michigan tribes and the state of Michigan, obviously they're allied, they're aligned with the state on this issue, but how strong a relationship do you tribes in Michigan have with the state and especially with this attorney general? And what does the future hold, do you think, in terms of just ongoing relationships between the tribal governments and state government there in the state of Michigan?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, both the governor's office, Governor Whitmer, and also the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, have been, strong advocates of protecting treaty resources and trying to improve relationships with tribes. But that said, there's still a long way to go. And so it's not perfect. And, for example, we saw the state of Michigan oppose the Little Traverse Bay Band's boundary reservations claim. And so, there are plenty of other instances where there are likely to be direct conflicts between the state of Michigan and tribal interests. And so it's certainly a very complicated relationship. But I do think that there have been a lot of improvements. And so one is, having the Michigan legislature now has a permanent person who is appointed by the tribes to ensure that legislation considered by the state legislature has to involve a consultation process with tribes in the state. And so things like that are definitely improving the relationship and improving greater access to important information about impacts on tribes before the legislature acts. So we're seeing some improvements.
1-800-996-2848. You can join this conversation if you have questions or comments. Again, talking about sovereignty issues in Michigan with regard to the Line 5 pipeline. And I want to bring another guest into our conversation now who joins us on Zoom from the Bad River Reservation in Wisconsin, Elizabeth Arbuckle. She is the chairwoman of the Bad River Tribe. Chairwoman, hello, and welcome to Native America Calling.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, you folks were successful in federal court arguing that Enbridge was illegally trespassing, and now they're proposing a reroute of Line 5 around the Bad River Reservation. Why is the tribe opposed to this now?
Yeah, we've been going around with Enbridge for well over 13 years, but they've been trespassing for 13 years. So we are opposed to their current reroute plan because it's still in our watershed, right? So basically the pipeline they proposed hugs our reservation. And our reservation is full of water, full of waterways, full of streams that obviously don't recognize political boundaries, like the deer and the other animals and the fish. They just follow the water paths. And so today we see them trying to hug into that area, which then could have huge ramifications if something goes wrong, or even during the reroute itself. Some of the processes they want to put into place. That stuff is going to come, upstream to us. or downstream, but our water flows north to Lake Superior. So it's going to come right into our reservation. So those are things we are very, very concerned about.
Okay. We're going to take another short break. We'll come back and talk more with Chairwoman Elizabeth Arbuckle and our other guests. And the phone lines are open for any listeners who would like to join this conversation today. Especially, I'm thinking of some of our listeners in Michigan who might be dialed into this issue with regard to the Line 5 pipeline, or perhaps there's a pipeline in your community, under your community, near your community that you have concerns with. And this issue today echoes those concerns in your community. You can pick up your phone right now. You can call us 1-800-996-2848. And our producers are standing by. They can take your call and you can share your thoughts on the air. Again, 1-800-99-NATIVE is the number to call. Or you can just go to our social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads, and you can comment that way. Or you can also go to our website at nativeamericacalling.com. And like I mentioned earlier, Enbridge has been a past underwriter for Native America Calling, and that fact does not have any influence on our editorial coverage of this issue today. So we're going to take that break. We'll come back, and we're going to just continue this conversation. We're going to get more insight, more perspective. And again, we're going to understand more of this history with regard to Line 5 and how it's impacting not just tribes in Michigan, but also, of course, here we have the chairwoman of the Bad River Tribe in Wisconsin, who also has issues with Line 5. So stay with us, folks. We'll be right back, and we'll continue this conversation.
Eighth Generation is a Seattle-based lifestyle brand owned by the Snoqualmie tribe, offering authentic native-designed blankets, jewelry, and gifts. More at Reservation Economic Summit booths 805 and 21, and at 8thgeneration.com, who support this show.
Kaufman & Associates is a Native-owned and led consulting firm, supporting Native communities with culturally grounded solutions to shape Indigenous futures. More at kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
You're listening to Native America Calling. Let's continue our conversation now with Bad River Tribal Chairwoman Elizabeth Arbuckle about the tribe's ongoing fight against the Line 5 pipeline. And again, the tribe is opposing a proposed reroute of Line 5 around tribal lands, and the reroute, according to the tribe, could pose a huge environmental risk. Listeners, you can listen back to this show and past shows on our website and all major podcast platforms. And Chairwoman Arbuckle, another issue I wanted to address with you is this proposed pipeline. It replaces one that is more than 70 years old. Wouldn't the replacement be a better environmental option than what is there now? 70 years, that's a really long time for a pipeline.
Yeah, we've actually heard that argument. I just want to say that before everything, I want to preface what I'm saying is that this experience with Enbridge has absolutely had severe social impacts on our reservation as well. It is really tearing apart our community. And there are people that feel, let them go around, people that are like, let them go through. It's really torn us up, and we are really trying to heal and come back together on this as a tribe, as a community, right? As who we are as a people. This is our homeland. So there are people that said, yeah, the pipeline could be new. Well, that's possible. We're looking at 1850s line, as some of your other guests have said. Technology has changed. Maybe this isn't the right place for this line to be. Like maybe they should, take a different route, perhaps through Canada or somewhere else. But, our concern is that if we're talking about this line was drawn back then, maybe time has changed and we look for another place. Another place that doesn't go on or near Bad River would be best, I guess you could say. So yes, they are talking about that, but there's things that are going to happen when they do put in the pipe that have concerns for us. There's going to be disruption. They're talking about exploding pieces of a mountain right off reservation, which has us very concerned about what that could do. They're going to be disturbing areas. We already have mercury that have, fallen from the sky, basically from parts unknown that have wound up here at Bad River that we are already trying to battle. Their activity straight off our reservation is going to possibly disturb that, or actually not possibly, definitely disturb that and create havoc for us. So it's all these little chain of events things that have concerns for us. It's about putting in the pipe, leaving the pipe, possible ruptures.
Okay. Chairwoman, you mentioned earlier how this issue is really taking a toll on the community, lots of disagreement with regard to what the ultimate solution should be. And it really jibes with a caller who, unfortunately, we lost them, so they can't be on the air right now, but they did have a question. Joe, actually, who's listening to the show in Traverse Bay, Michigan on Interlochen Public Radio. And his question is, how do you balance energy costs with environmental concerns? And I'm sure that's something you folks are having to deal with every day, right? I mean, we see the price of gas and we see how much, how dependent we are as a nation and Native communities as well on fossil fuels. But at the same time, of course, these environmental concerns, these cultural concerns. What are some of the conversations you have there with your constituents among the Bad River people on that front?
Well, we're working on energy sovereignty and independence, and that maybe isn't putting in our cars, but we are getting EV vehicles. We're putting together a brand new microgrid to help provide energy to our community. So we are looking at different sources of energy using sunlight right out of the sky. So what bothers me about, like you said, the effects it's had is that, Enbridge, since I've gotten on council and become chair, they've been doing this for a while. They have just held us hostage. This company has been playing this full court press offense against us from the beginning. And our only option has been to play defense against one of the most well-funded, expertly staffed, and unrelenting corporations in existence. A company which seems to refuse to recognize our right to exercise sovereign control over the only remaining homeland we have. And that's really critical. You look at one of your speakers talked about treaties, and that 1854 treaty, which created the Bad River Reservation, states the United States agrees to set apart and withhold from sale for the use of the Chippewas of Lake Superior the following described tracts of land, and then it proceeds to list Bad River. And we look at that, and the Americans and the Ojibwe agreed on those words, withhold from sale, and they meant that. So if we look at that in the broader sense, is that land in this space, we have our reservation boundaries, but we also have our ceded territories, right? So these things were always meant from the 1850s, before that, to be something that we were taking care of. It was life-sustaining, and we sustain it, right? That ecosystem together. So we have had people that talked about, energy. Well, I'm not going to get into the whole energy crisis on this, but there are things we are doing to create energy resiliency and sovereignty, as I mentioned, with the microgrids.
Okay, let's take another caller. This is Denise in Washburn, Wisconsin, who's listening on WOJB. Hi, Denise. You are on the air.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for taking my call. I just want to say that, it's time for us to pay attention. The world is crying out. We go and we destroy things, and it's the big companies that are coming in for the money. We need to pay attention. We need to start taking ramifications for our people to start making changes. And that would start with not letting big companies put these oil pipelines in, take them out. We've already destroyed the lands up in Canada, and then we did that on Line 3, and now we're looking at destroying the lands and our area. So let's just pay attention. The world is crying out. We need to stop this. Take the ramifications, leave the oil in the ground, and it'll fight and it will make us start to change our ways. We need to get back to the earth. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Denise. And Chairwoman, it sounds like you and Denise are on the same page here.
Yeah, it does actually. Washburn isn't far from our reservation. She's just a stone's throw away, actually. To paraphrase, I guess, Chief Seattle, when the last tree's been cut down, the last fish is caught, the last river poisoned, only then will we realize that we cannot eat money. So yeah, we've been thinking about this for generations, right? We have a commitment to our ancestors who left this land and entrusted us to take care of it, and to the seventh generations, the kids and people behind us. We're just here for this very tiny, short piece of time. So it's important that we take care of the environment. Yesterday was UN's World Water Day. I don't know if you planned this segment because of that, but so I wrote a little piece for the Bad River Facebook page, and I put some beautiful pictures of our water, our lake, our river, different aspects of who we are, and it's important, as UN points out, when 2.1 billion people don't have access to safe water. Our blessings here are just incredible that we have all this beautiful, safe, clean water. And of course, we're going to take care of it. Of course, we're committed to it. It's not only for our folks here, but, the planet needs clean water. We have to preserve what we can, where we can, and when we can.
Chairwoman, the tribe has also argued against some of the state waterway permits that have been granted to Enbridge. What's the issue with these permits? And again, what are some of these other possible environmental risks?
Well, right. So the permitting is interesting because I did talk to the governor's office about this and their DNR person, and we're really disappointed that they basically allowed this reroute. They allowed the permit to go so far. Like I said, everything's in continued litigation. It's hard to kind of keep track. I feel like I need a cheat sheet or a scorecard. But they allowed it. And when I said, how could you do this? Like, you're supposed to preserve the natural resources of Wisconsin. And they made a really good point. They're like, well, we're just administrative, right? It's about the laws. It's the state legislature has to make good laws for them to enforce, right? So if we back that up and do a little history lesson there, you can't make something out of nothing. So we really need to look at our state legislatures and what they're passing, because what they're passing then will be implemented by our executive branch, right? So as we used to say in college, when it comes to research, junk in, junk out, right? So you got to make good laws that we can then implement in good ways. It's all important, right?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned just the need for good, clean water, drinking water, and I want to ask you about proposed rollbacks to EPA standards, specifically with the Clean Water Act. How does that play into all these decisions?
Yeah, our staff is absolutely looking at that. We're already engaged in responses, our own studies, and definitely our responses to and creating comments for it. We are concerned about any rollback in water quality standards. Everyone should be concerned about that. We need to drink clean water and breathe clean air. So we are working on that and responding to it. I'm not going to get into the details of the minutia, but yeah, it's something we should all be worried about. It just goes back to the same with the state is the same with the feds.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your own research. Can you share any data that you folks have uncovered with regard to clean water?
Oh, Sean, I was not ready with that. I'm sorry.
No worries.
I don't have that at my fingertips, so I do apologize.
Hey, no worries. But these rollbacks, though, I mean, obviously further implications for this project than those like it, right?
I'm sorry?
The rollbacks, the EPA proposed rollbacks, obviously that will have big implications for this project and possibly others like it going forward.
Right. I mean, we absolutely have to pay attention to, like I said, the administrative, those rollbacks, but also the legislature. Congress can do some things there, right, in terms of creating laws that are going to be enforceable. And that's important. We need to talk to our Congress people. We need to work with EPA and other folks. This is for all of us, right? We should all be very, very invested in what's happening, because like Seattle said, you can't eat money. So we got to make sure we have clean water and clean soil and clean air so we can keep eating and drinking and staying alive every day.
Chairwoman Elizabeth Arbuckle from the Bad River Reservation in Wisconsin, talking today about Line 5, her community's history with Line 5, and also the present. And I want to go back now to Melissa Kay with the Native American Rights Fund. She is a Tribal Water Institute Fellow at NARF. And again, Melissa, going back to this idea of the one caller we had, how do you balance energy costs with environmental concerns? And do you see a way, Melissa, to have energy security and sufficient environmental protections? And if so, what type of model could that possibly look like?
So I think just in terms of kind of looping back to the alternatives that I was talking about before that have been put in front of courts and have been put in front of Enbridge, in terms of what is an alternative to having a pipeline running through the Great Lakes that would, cause this extremely existential threat to not only the tribal nations whose ceded territory the Great Lakes is, but also, the public in terms of clean drinking water. And those alternatives, that includes, like I said before, the expansion of existing pipelines and other ways of carrying petroleum products. And then there's that other thing that I raised when we were talking about sort of the current instability around oil, which is that it's actually really important to be thinking about alternatives to oil. And there's a real danger with, over-reliance on one type of energy. And so, yeah, the question that Chairwoman Arbuckle raised of, what does it mean to pursue energy sovereignty? I think a lot of tribal nations are taking that into consideration. And then also just thinking about, part of the issue that Bay Mills have faced at least in the Army Corps context, like with one of the many permits that Enbridge is required to get for this proposed tunnel project, is that, the current administration declared an energy emergency. And so all of a sudden, the impact that that's had on the process has been to speed through and reduce all of the normal regulatory sort of barriers, but also protections for considering impacts to tribal cultural resources, for considering impacts to environmental resources, et cetera. And actually, the tribal nations that had been involved as cooperating agencies in that Army Corps process withdrew because we really object to the idea of this energy emergency and the ways that this administration has responded to that. Because in reality, this is an existing pipeline that's carrying a certain amount of oil. And the tunnel project, for example, that's just going to be continuing at the same capacity. And so there isn't, something that's an emergency about continuing something that has existed. And really what ends up being at stake here for the tribes is that if the tunnel is, permitted, or if the reroute goes through, as Chairwoman Arbuckle was talking about, you were sort of mentioning, okay, isn't it better if there's a replacement for a 70-year-old pipeline? But the reality is that these replacements just further entrench the existence of a pipeline through incredibly important cultural and environmental locations. And so that entrenchment just expands the lifetime of this pipeline and the risk, the existential risk of a catastrophe for places that sustain tribes' cultural practices, spiritual identity, and economic livelihoods. So, in terms of thinking about that original question of balancing, the concerns around environmental risks and energy costs, is that it's a broader conversation than that. There are other costs that have to be considered, and historically, the tribe's treaty rights and protection of the tribe's cultural practices has been completely left out of the conversation.
All right, and with that, we're out of time. We're going to have to wrap up this show. But big thanks to our guests today, Melissa Kay, Chairwoman Elizabeth Arbuckle, and Professor Winona Single. Join us again tomorrow for another live conversation about topics important to our listeners. I'm Sean Spruce.
Support from Davis Keelan Law Firm, a New Mexico firm standing with Native families suffering catastrophic loss. When tragedy strikes Indian country, Davis Keelan fights to restore stability, dignity, and justice, bringing a voice to Native families and communities for 20 years. More information, daviskeelan.com.
Support from Rodale, publisher of A Feather and a Fork, 125 Intertribal Dishes from an Indigenous Food Warrior by Crystal Wapipa with Amy Page Condon, and a foreword by Tommy Orange is now available for purchase wherever books are sold. Who protects Indian country? Amerind does. As the only 100% tribally owned insurance carrier, Amerind helps strengthen tribal communities by providing reliable insurance coverage and keeping dollars in Indian country. From property and liability to commercial auto and tribal workers' compensation, Amerind is here to protect what matters. Celebrating 40 years of serving Indian country. Learn more at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Quantic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.